Well, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to you. My name is Jamie Lindsay, and as chair of UKAS, it gives me great pleasure to welcome so many of you to the UKAS 25th anniversary lecture. I'm also especially delighted to welcome Dame Judith Hackitt as our guest speaker today. I will introduce Dame Judith more fully in a moment, but before I do that, I'd like to reflect on why we are here today. As most of you will know, UKAS is the national accreditation body appointed by government, and as such, it fulfills a unique role in providing the ultimate level of oversight and accreditation in areas such as quality, safety, health, consumer protection, and the environment. Many, indeed most parts of government, business, and society benefit from the trust, confidence, and assurance that UKAS accreditation brings. It is no exaggeration to say that the work of UKAS touches all our lives on a daily basis, often in ways that we do not realize, or we take for granted, or we never see. From providing confidence in the testing that assures the quality of our drinking water, to the safety of the electrical products we use, the vital work that UKAS does is all around us. Consequently, UKAS works with stakeholders from across all sectors to deliver accreditation for every kind of activity, from healthcare to construction, from energy to forensics, from food and farming to transport, and from the environment to financial services. I'm delighted to see that so many of those stakeholders have been able to join this webinar, not least from BEIS, our sponsoring department, and the many other government departments, agencies, and regulators with whom we work. Now, in a normal year, we would have been welcoming you to one of our engagement events, such as our summer reception at the House of Lords, or our AGM and annual lunch at the RAC Club. You don't need me to tell you that this has not been a normal year, and hence that we have not been able to celebrate UKAS's 25th anniversary face-to-face. But before I speak about the challenges of 2020, I would like to take a brief look back on the 25 years leading up to it. Of course, UKAS did not simply appear from thin air in 1995. We can trace our origins very clearly back over 50 years to the formation of BCS, the British Calibration Service, in 1966. In 1981, NATLIS was launched by the National Physical Laboratory to provide independent accreditation of testing laboratories. And in 1985, BCS and NATLIS were merged to form NAMAS, the National Measurement Accreditation Service. 10 years later, in 1995, NAMAS and NACCB, the National Council for Certification Bodies, merged at the behest of government to form UKAS, and it is that anniversary that we are here to celebrate. Further developments since that time saw UKAS joined by the Institute of Mechanical Engineers Inspection Bodies Service, and in 2010, CPA, the Clinical Pathology Accreditation Service. The acquisition of CPA firmly consolidated UKAS's role in providing healthcare accreditation, a role that has particularly come to the fore in helping the UK respond to the current pandemic. And since 2010, the healthcare sector schemes ISAS, now known as QSI, the Quality Standard for Imaging, and IQIPS, Improving Quality in Physiological Services, have been established. The position of UKAS in the national quality infrastructure was further reinforced by the Accreditation Regulations 2009, following on from the European legislation EC 765/2008. And I'm happy to confirm that UKAS will continue to be appointed as the UK's national accreditation body beyond the 31st of December this year and the end of the transition period. In the 25 years since 1995, UKAS has grown steadily from a team of 60 people delivering a relatively limited scope of accreditation activities into the world-leading accreditation organization that it is today, employing over 260 full-time staff and utilizing over 700 technical assessors whose skills and experience cover virtually all sectors of industry, business, public services, and society. I take pride in the fact that UKAS is regularly at the international forefront of the development of accreditation into new areas, such as digital forensics and biobanking. I also take pride in the frequency with which UKAS's expertise is sought by other countries to help them develop their own accreditation services. Now, with such a broad range of activities, it puts me in an invidious position to pick out just one or two examples of UKAS's work. Nevertheless, I'm going to do just that. Firstly, healthcare has grown to become the largest of UKAS's scheme areas, and it is one that has very much been in the spotlight in recent months. UKAS has been able to provide invaluable independent advice to the Department of Health and Social Care, NHS England and Public Health England in response to the pandemic, and we are actively involved in the accreditation of laboratories for COVID-19 testing. Secondly, I want to highlight the considerable work that UKAS has been doing in the wake of the Grenfell Tower tragedy in support of MHCLG and the Competence Steering Group, which, as you will hear shortly, is pertinent to Dame Judith's lecture. I've chosen those two examples because they are excellent illustrations of the role that UKAS fulfills, regularly working with government and other stakeholders to provide assurance, protection, trust, and confidence. Having mentioned COVID-19, it would be remiss of me not to reflect on the challenges of the last 9 months. Even before the Prime Minister's announcement on the 23rd of March, UKAS had already activated contingency plans, cancelling on-site assessments, bringing assessors home from overseas visits, and moving all staff to working from home. And before March was out, we had already commenced conducting remote assessments using a variety of technologies, something that we had been contemplating for the future, but which had not progressed beyond being a theoretical possibility. This sudden change in approach required UKAS staff and customers to adapt very quickly, and yet within weeks, this had become the norm, setting an example that has been followed by many of UKAS's international peers. I would like to pay tribute to everyone in UKAS for the way they have stepped up to these very different circumstances and have done such an impressive job in keeping the business moving forward and maintaining the validity and robustness of our accreditation services. So, despite all the challenges of the post-COVID and post-Brexit world that lie ahead, I feel that UKAS can look forward with great confidence to the next 25 years. It has proved itself to be a valued and reliable partner for government, for business, and for society. And in a world of volatility, uncertainty, and complexity, the need for impartiality, credibility, and assurance that UKAS brings has never been greater. So in conclusion, I would like to thank all our stakeholders, not just for your time in attending today, but because UKAS exists to serve you and to work in partnership with you. And it is because of working in partnership with you that UKAS has made such tremendous progress over the last 25 years and can look forward with such confidence to the next 25 years. Now, at this point, I would like to introduce our guest speaker, Dame Judith Hackitt. Dame Judith commenced her career as a chemical engineer and later worked with the European Chemical Industries Council in Brussels. In 2007, she became chair of the Health and Safety Commission and then of the Health and Safety Executive until 2016. She has held senior executive and non-executive positions at many leading organizations. Following the terrible events at Grenfell Tower in June 2017, Dame Judith was asked by the government to conduct a review into building regulations and fire safety. I'm not going to preempt what Dame Judith is going to say, but what I can tell you is that although her review was focused on the construction and building maintenance sectors, it is clear that the issues that Dame Judith uncovered could exist, and very possibly do exist, in many other sectors, especially where supply chains are involved. I'm sure, therefore, that whatever your role and whatever your sector, you will find Dame Judith's talk deeply insightful and thought-provoking. Before I hand over to Dame Judith, please note that there will be an opportunity for questions at the end of her talk. Please submit your questions using the chat function, and Matt Gantley, the UKAS CEO, will moderate these when we get to the Q&A session. So, without further ado, I'd like to thank Dame Judith for agreeing to deliver this lecture, and I'll now hand over to her. Dame Judith.
Jamie, thank you, and good morning, everyone. It truly is an honour to be invited to deliver this lecture on the occasion of the 25th anniversary of UKAS, and I would like to offer my personal congratulations to UKAS for all of the good work that you do in so many sectors of our society. As you've heard, I'm going to talk about my journey into building safety, which took place post Grenfell Tower. But I do also want to consider how the lessons that we've learned as a result of that and the actions that are now being taken have much broader implications. And as Jamie has already highlighted, I think this is particularly timely as we think about the UK emerging from 2020 and rebuilding our whole economy and rebuilding the confidence of society in our ability to go forward from what has been the most unusual and most trying year that I think any of us have experienced in our lifetimes. So let's start with the story of how I became involved, and let's move on to the first slide. As you heard, in August 2017, I was invited to conduct the independent review of building regulations and fire safety. This is not to be confused with the public inquiry, which is ongoing. The public inquiry was announced first. It took some time to get going, but as you know, it is still going, and I'll refer to that later. But the brief that I was given by this then Secretary of State when he asked me to do this work in August 2017 was to look at the regulatory system, to review what had gone wrong with building regulations and fire safety regulations that had resulted not only in the Grenfell Tower fire, the massive tragedy that occurred there, but which in the weeks immediately after Grenfell had already identified that this was not a one-off in terms of poor quality of build and incorrect materials being used, but in fact there were many more tower blocks around the country where similar risks existed. And so it was quite clear that somehow or another there had been a failure in our regulatory system. After an interim report at the end of the year, my final report was published in May 2018. That was to the timetable asked of me by the Secretary of State. It was very clear that this piece of work needed to be done urgently, and that's what we did. Since then, I've been involved in the Industry Safety Steering Group, which I will say more about in a moment. But just to complete the picture in terms of what is happening as a result of the recommendations of my review, as I think many of you on this attending this lecture will know, the government announced some 7 months after my final report that it would implement all of the recommendations. I'm now involved not just with the Industry Safety Steering Group, but also in chairing the transition board that will set up the new regulator. And we are now, at long last, able to quell any doubts that this is going to lead to change, because as of July this year, the draft Building Safety Bill was published. It's been through its pre-legislative scrutiny. It will be introduced into the House formally early next year. And we are going to see one of the biggest changes in building safety regulation in a generation. However, one of the things I do want to talk about in that timeline is that in order to make this change real and to deliver what we need to see, and again, I'll say more about that. This is not just about making a change to regulation. This is very much about needing to drive culture change within an industry that for far too long has shown little care, not just for the safety of the buildings they build, but for the quality of the buildings that they build. And that lies at the heart of what we have to address going forward. So this is about driving culture change across a whole industry sector. From those who commission the buildings, those who design the buildings, through procurement, through residential property management, and those who provide the products that are used in construction. So the whole supply chain in its many, many guises. I've mentioned also on this slide, of course, COVID-19. Not just because at the same time that we are trying to implement this massive change in an industry, we were hit with this huge crisis around COVID-19 itself, and the need for some of the urgent remediation work that was already underway to continue, but also because I think it just shows how interconnected so many of these issues are. If you and I think the last 9 months has been difficult, sitting at home in our houses, think how much more difficult that has been for people living in high-rise buildings, knowing that the buildings they're living in are in need of remediation and the fire risk of those buildings has yet to be resolved. It must feel for them like living in a prison and feeling very insecure. But I will also say more later in my lecture about what I think we've learned, because I do think COVID has taught us some important lessons about what we are capable of, which we need to translate into the way that we address this culture change going forward. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's look on the next slide at what some of the things were that came out of my review. This is about the diagnosis of what had gone wrong. And again, I apologize because I know there are some people on this lecture who've heard a lot of this before, but it's important that we all understand the scale and the magnitude of the problem that was uncovered. You heard a little earlier in this talk about my background. What was clearly missing from there was any experience in construction prior to 2017. My background has been in the chemicals industry prior to working in HSE, so very much in a different sector, and that brought for me a very strong respect for safety and quality from that background in chemicals. What I also think as a chemical engineer that I brought to this review was not just my experience of a different sector, but also my way of thinking. Chemical engineers are taught to think about things as systems and taught to think about how a whole system will work. What I encountered when I looked at construction was anything but systems thinking. People looking at their piece of the puzzle in isolation with no real regard for how that fitted into the final outcome and delivery of safe buildings. I think it was also relevant and important that I was not a lawyer, because what I was not able to do and did not set out to do from the start of this review was to try and understand the legalities of the current regulatory system. What I actually did was to map it out, to look at how it was supposed to work as the system, and to find the flaws and the weaknesses in that system and why it did not work in practice. And what I identified were some of the things that I've shared with you on this slide. The current system was weak and ineffective in as much as the level of enforcement was low, the visibility of enforcement on sites is low, and indeed, even where enforcement does take place, the penalties are ridiculously small in this system. So it was very clear that a new regulator was going to be needed. But what also shocked me was the behaviour of people in industry. Some would argue, and with some justification, that that was a direct result of the regulatory system being so weak. But what actually was happening was that people who were part of the system in industry were simply allowing themselves to get away with whatever they could, gaming the system, using the rules as the minimum they could get away with, or in some cases, even quite cynically saying, well, if the rules don't tell me I can't do this, I'll assume I can. So no real regard at all for quality. I also encountered conflicts of interest, people being employed to do things where their independence was critical to them being able to carry out the role, but they were not independent. The whole process of managing change through the design process, keeping records of what actually gets built was shockingly poor, in my view. Experts who did raise concerns were not listened to. Residents were not listened to. And the culture of the whole construction and built environment industry, therefore, really did need to change, was one of my diagnoses. I also want to talk not just about the culture of the industry and what underpins that in terms of competence, and I will say more about competence in a moment, but I also want to highlight the fact that the way in which the products that are used within this industry are tested, marketed, and labelled is, to be kind, opaque. I would say deliberately opaque, so that substitution can take place with ease and without the necessary quality assurance to ensure that the right materials are being used in the right applications. I talked earlier about my commitment to systems thinking. One of the things about that means that people need to be trained in a very different way. They need to be trained to ensure not only that they are capable of doing their own job, but that they understand how their role links to the role of others and fits into the broader system. And as a result of that, my review also included an extensive list of activity that needed to take place around raising competence and the levels of quality assurance across the whole of this sector. So on the next slide, I'm just going to summarize some of the principles that will be in play in the new system as it is introduced. We're going to be looking at a systems-based approach to both regulation and also to considering buildings in their own right as competent systems, complex systems. Competence, accountability, and responsibility are going to be at the heart of the system. And at this point, I want to pay a huge tribute to a large number of people who have stepped up and been involved in developing that competency framework. It has been an enormous task led by Graham Watts, and I am hugely grateful to him and all of his team for the work that they've done on developing that competence framework. But that also has to come hand in hand with a culture change across the whole industry. One that is committed to delivering quality and safety. This is an industry that had to take a journey some 20 years ago to take a different approach to managing the safety of its own employees. Construction had a very poor safety record in relation to employee safety. But it has changed that. It has changed that over the last 20 years. Now it has to make that same journey again in relation to committing to the safety and quality of the buildings that it provides for the people who will live in those buildings. That's going to require positive incentives for those who do the right thing, and punitive, serious sanctions for those who try to flout or game the system. The new system will be risk-based and proportionate. It will be simpler, but please don't confuse simple with easy. It will be a simpler and more straightforward regime, but it will be tougher, it will be more robust, and it will be a joined up regulatory system. It will be an outcomes-based framework that will encourage and ensure that we are clear who owns responsibility and who is accountable at every point in the process. The focus is going to shift to delivering quality buildings which are safe and which people feel safe when they are living in them. So moving on to the next slide, I've mentioned quality already several times within my presentation. But I just want to be specific here about why I see quality and safety as being so interlinked in this whole process. Because just as without clear responsibility, no one takes ownership of delivering safety, the same is also true of quality. If no one is clearly responsible, we don't get the quality of the final outcome that we're looking for. If the motivation is all about doing what the rules say, or what the rules allow me to get away with, that does not lead to quality dwellings which are fit for purpose. That is why we're on this journey to a fundamental culture change, and the only way, in my view, in which we can deliver that, and I said this very clearly in my review, that all needs to be underpinned with a system of assurance and third-party accreditation. This is an industry sector that is not slow to hand out certificates of competence. But for those certificates of competence to have value and worth, they have to be properly third-party accredited, so that those of us who are affected by the work that is done can truly have trust and confidence that those qualifications and those assurances of competence and of material quality, because we must not forget that product piece, is actually assured by third-party accreditation. So I now want to talk about progress on my next slide. I mentioned earlier that I now have 2 roles within the system. So having done the review within a year, almost immediately in 2018, the Secretary of State asked me to lead the work to drive the culture change within the industry. More recently, he's also asked me to get involved in chairing the transition board that will deliver the new building safety regulator, which I'm happy to talk about later. But primarily in this slide, I want to talk about what we've learned from the industry safety steering group, which has been set up and which is driving that culture change across the industry. We've been going for over 2 years now. We've written 2 annual reports back to government. And what we've seen is a good deal of progress, not least, as I've already said, from that group of people who have stepped up to develop the competence framework. But that's not all. We've seen significant progress on a number of other fronts, but by no means enough yet. There are still too many people who are waiting for the regulations to tell them what to do. The regulations won't tell them what to do, by the way. This is an outcomes-based system we are developing, And one of the key messages we have to get over is that responsibility for delivering safe outcomes shifts to people making decisions and being held to account, not simply doing what the rules tell them. What lies behind why we're waiting, or why they are waiting, however, is about industry leadership. There's not enough of it. There's not enough people in this sector who are willing to step up and be proactive about doing the right thing. The fragmentation of the sector is used as an excuse, and I genuinely think it is an excuse. If the industry is too fragmented to get its act together on delivering something as important as safety and quality, then the structure of the industry needs to change and become less fragmented. We're now also seeing that other people are alert to these issues. The insurance and financial markets are sensitized to these concerns, and that is manifesting itself in a number of different ways, some of which are deeply distressing. It is now very, very difficult for some professionals in this sector to get professional indemnity insurance. And more worryingly, for people who live in high-rise buildings, it's becoming increasingly difficult for them to sell their properties because they cannot get access to assurance on the materials that their buildings are made of, and the fact that their buildings are safe, and therefore the valuations are being affected by that. And it's a huge problem. We do need to recognize also that this is a challenge both to new build, to change practices and improve for the future. But one of the biggest challenges of implementing my review is around addressing the existing stock of buildings. That stock of buildings that were built during this period when the regulatory system was broken, and now need to be remediated so that the people who live in them can be confident that those buildings are safe. That means there are decisions that need to be being taken now, actions that need to be taken now, well ahead of the regulation, because it is 3 years since Grenfell, and we really should not be expecting people to live with these issues in the way some of them still are. On the next slide, I just want to talk about what I think are some of the lessons of COVID, because I think these are positive, and I think they are things that we can apply and think about as we take this journey to higher quality and better safety in the buildings that we all live in. What we've learned in the last 9 months, yet again, is that this is an industry sector in all its guises and in all areas that is capable of massive change at pace when it's called upon to do so, and where the imperative is there, as it was with COVID. It is capable of changing its practices quickly without compromising safety and quality. It knows how to collaborate and cooperate, despite keep telling us all how fragmented they are and how difficult that makes things. In the last 9 months, we've seen levels of collaboration and cooperation that would not have been thought possible prior to then. What we also know is that business as usual is not coming back anytime soon. Perhaps it never will. So it will be those who change and those who adapt quickly and proactively who are going to be the successful companies emerging from this crisis. So this is a real opportunity as we step into 2021 to drive safety and quality together. Going back now to building safety on my next slide, I just want to talk about some of the key features of the future system, and particularly to focus on where I think this touches upon the areas where UKAS can add value, because those areas are many and various. There is going to be a focus in the new system on demonstrating safety and fitness for purpose of buildings for use and occupation across the whole industry. Giving people assurance that buildings are fit for purpose. That gets referred to, and I referred to it in my review, as a safety case approach, making the case for why that building is okay. There will be gateways in the system of building new buildings and indeed of managing existing buildings that will ensure that they are regularly reviewed during design and commissioning and in occupation to ensure that they remain fit for purpose and safe for people to live in. That's going to require an evidence base, and it's going to require proof that buildings are being kept in the condition that they were when they were deemed to be safe. This means the supply chain has got to get its act together and quickly. It needs to be ready and able to provide data and performance accreditation. It's going to need to get its head around collaboration and data sharing, standardized systems, performance testing on a much more frequent basis than happens today, greater transparency, less substitution, providing advice and guidance on how things should be used and where they can be used, rather than simply marketing products and leaving others to decide. In my old sector, chemicals, this was talked about in terms of product stewardship. I think that's what this sector needs to get its head around. This all goes hand in hand with competent people. I don't know how many of you have listened to some of the evidence being given to the public inquiry. I just want you to remember that I said these things more than 2 years ago. Everything I said that was wrong with this sector is being borne out day after day in the cynical approach this industry took to the refurbishment at Grenfell and the evidence that's being presented to the public inquiry for any of you who are listening. So let's just look in the next slide at what this means for existing buildings. This is going to be a big challenge. We think in the new regulatory system there are about 13,000 buildings that will be in scope for this new regime, and they will require improvements to be made in many cases. Not all, because some of them will be fine, but as yet we don't know which they are and which ones are the ones that will require the work. And not knowing is no excuse. We have to give people assurance. We have to let people know what the state of their building is and make a commitment to improve them. And we need to do that primarily for the residents and for their assurance, but not exclusively. As I've already said, we know that the mortgage lenders, the insurers are all expressing their concerns about what they're being asked to underwrite and fund. A major job in terms of rebuilding confidence. On the next slide, I'll just touch on what this means for new build, because this will be a very different approach to the way in which new build takes place. I believe it will require a digital approach. I find it extraordinary that this sector is so far behind other sectors of the economy in terms of product traceability and record keeping of what actually gets built as a final product versus where the intent started out. We will need greater assurance. Terms like value engineering need to stop meaning do it on the cheap and truly mean let's give value through what we engineer, through giving quality and real value. We have to have building owners and occupiers and financiers all demanding that proof of quality from the people they engage. And right now, I think we need to get people stepping up to that rather than waiting until the regulations arrive in 2 years' time, because we are simply making the problem worse until such time as we do that. I now want to move on my next slide to thinking about how this might impact upon the rest of the construction sector, because clearly what I've been talking about is very much focused on high-rise residential buildings. But my hope is that this approach will filter out into the rest of the construction sector, because feeling safe in one's home should be everyone's right, no matter what type of building they live in or where that is. In focusing on high-rise, why do we do that? Well, simply because lots of people are all living together, and the potential for catastrophic failure and multiple lives to be lost is highest where the population density is highest, clearly. So that's why the focus is on high-rise. But having said that, we need to be adopting a proportionate approach, but a similar approach, in my view, to all buildings. And that means that competence and quality assurance has to become part of the culture across the whole of the sector. So finally, on my last slide then, just summarising, change is most definitely coming. The regulatory regime is going to change. So those who doubted that it would happen can sit back now. It is going to happen. But waiting to be told what to do is simply not going to work. Because as I've said, this is a different type of regime that requires people to take responsibility, take ownership, and demonstrate to the new regulator that you are doing the right things. Leaders need to step up and take action and show that this industry can yet again rebuild confidence with residents and with other stakeholders. It needs to learn the lessons, showing some humility as well as courage, and innovation is going to be important. I don't think this confidence can be rebuilt without independent review and accreditation of both the people and the systems and the products that are used in this industry. As I've said, COVID has changed the landscape in many ways, but I think there are lessons we can learn from it. So we must make the most of this opportunity within the sector and more broadly. My final reflections are personal ones. As I've said, I worked in the chemical industry for many years. During that time, I made an assumption. And my assumption was that other sectors had similar approaches to managing complex systems, be they regulatory systems, supply chains, or operating systems like complex buildings. That assumption was clearly wrong, because when I arrived in this sector, I found them absent. So for me, there is a much broader lesson in all of this, which is about learning lessons between different sectors and sharing good practice and learning how to apply some of the well-developed methodologies that already exist in other sectors. Because safety and quality, for me, are undoubtedly in the same box as resilience. And we all know that what we need to rebuild in 2021 is greater resilience in every aspect of our economy. Thank you.
Dame Judith, thank you for that tour de force. I want to thank you properly at the end, but first of all, Matt, you're going to moderate the Q&A session.
Yes, thank you very much, Jamie. Good morning, everybody. And thank you, Dame Judith, for your lecture, which is both insightful on the problem in design, construction and maintenance of buildings, and certainly rousing in terms of the changes that need to happen in the future. to just remind everyone to take this opportunity and use the chat facility to raise any questions for Dame Judith. While we wait for the questions to come through, and we can also already see that there's been quite a few questions. Dame Judith, can I just turn to you? You produced your report 11 months after the Grenfell disaster. That must have involved a huge amount of effort in mobilizing resources. How did you set about such a large task of bringing together so many different voices and inputs?
It's an interesting question, and it was a new experience for me to do something like this and to set that up. I would like to say that I had excellent support from a team within CLG, but who were seconded to me to work in support of me away from the rest of the civil servants within the Department of Communities and Local Government, and there were some excellent people in that team. But what was also very notable, I think, was that in the weeks immediately after the tragedy at Grenfell, there were an awful lot of people who had been in this sector for years who openly admitted to me their shock and their shame at what had happened, and who came to me volunteering to do what they could and to help in any way that they could to put this right. People said, we knew this system was broken, but we never ever believed it could deliver such a tragic outcome. Now we do. We must change it, and we want to support you. So I had excellent support from a lot of people in the sector.
Thank you, Dame Judith. Your report was very clear and hard-hitting and made reference to a regulatory regime that was not fit for purpose. And you've touched upon the conversations that you've had throughout the industry about the fact that things were broken and that the system needs to fundamentally change. Since Grenfell, there has been a number of serious fires, for example, the Cube in Bolton, Richmond House and Worcester Park. And fortunately, in those cases, there wasn't any loss of life. But do you think this indicates that the problem is more deep-seated, more longer-lasting, more widespread, and still key issues that are unaddressed? Do you feel because of these continuing fires that the construction industry hasn't woke up yet to the problem?
I think the response is mixed. As I said in my presentation, I think we are seeing significant evidence of organisations throughout the sector, whether they be housing associations, construction companies, and others who are really working hard to make change. But it's not universal by any means. Yes, there are some who are still taking that somewhat cynical approach, whether driven by cost or whatever, you know, but I'm very clear their motivation is misguided because it shows a lack of concern for the people who live in those properties. I think the Cube is a good example where one of two buildings was remediated and the other wasn't. Why would you do that? So I think yes, that it is evidence that we're not there yet, and there is much work to be done for sure.
Thank you.
We're never going to stop fires in high-rise buildings. What we have to do, however, is ensure that when they occur, they are contained, and above all else, that the people in those buildings can remain safe, whether they stay in them or get out. Whatever happens, the people need to be safe.
Thank you, Dame Judith. You talked in detail about quality and safety and ultimately competence. That needs to be underpinned by third-party accreditation, and clearly UKAS stands ready alongside the Engineering Council to assist wherever we can and assist the new regulator. But have you detected through the industry safety steering groups and the new transition board a resistance or a concern perhaps on the other side in some quarters to moving towards an impartial approach to third-party evaluation of competence and quality and safety?
Again, I think it's mixed. I think there are some who are very open to it and who do recognise why third-party accreditation is so important. But I think there are others who, if we took the pressure off, would be more than happy to develop their own in-house schemes for accreditation without that third-party verification. And I think it's absolutely clear that for all of the safety critical roles in this new system, we cannot allow that to happen. It has to be independently verified.
Thank you. Actually, I've got a question here from Graham Watts at the CIC. There's a clear difference in view of the government and the HCLG committees on the need for third-party accreditation for professionals working on higher risk buildings. What do you see as a role of the independent third-party accreditation for all those working on higher risk buildings, i.e. not just those in the duty holder roles?
That's quite a detailed question. I think the priority is to ensure that those people in those safety critical duty holder roles are addressed first. I personally think that for many other roles within the sector, throughout construction, those who are working on construction of buildings, we still need verification of their qualifications, but I don't necessarily think that is accreditation of every individual. I think if particular sectors want to have qualifications, as long as those qualifications have been independently accredited, then they can hand them out but that process needs to be assured, because what we've seen in the past is accreditation and qualification cards handed out in this sector as if they were playing cards with very little value attached to them. And what we have to do is ensure that when someone says they are competent to do something, it means something.
Absolutely. So I have a question here from, again, one of the attendees. How much work is needed to educate the clients, the local authority, the resident, the building owner on how to procure quality and safety of buildings? You touched upon this a number of times in terms of the importance of supply chain drivers of quality and safety. Could you give us your thoughts on that?
Yes, how much is a difficult question to answer. Do I think there is a need to educate those who do the procuring, those who do the commissioning? Yes, there is. Absolutely. I think it really is about that. But and I think what's interesting to me is that every one of us has to change. Because anyone on this conference call who has ever bought a new house will know that one of the first things we all do when we buy a brand new house is that we walk around it with a piece of paper and a pen and we pull up the snagging list of things that need fixing. Think about what that tells us. That tells us that we all expect any new building to have faults. We are all complicit in letting the industry get away with less than good quality.
Thank you. I have a question here from Mark Fowler. The contractual risk passed down the supply chain and a squeeze on margins to unrealistic levels in the construction sector contributes to these unacceptable behaviours. This is driven ultimately by the client and both public sector and private sector. What can ultimately be done to address that?
Again, I think it is that is a problem that the industry itself has to address through the whole supply chain. And I think the sooner those conversations start between the leaders of the different elements of the sector, the better. That has happened because it's been allowed to happen. This needs a reset, and this needs people to recognise that squeezing people on margins, asking them to build things that simply cannot be built for the money that's being put on the table, is going to lead to the behaviours that we've seen in the past, and that we have to collaborate and work together to deliver the right outcomes. That's the reset that has to take place.
Thank you. A simple question. When can we expect for the Building Safety Regulator to be up and running?
Okay, so the Building Safety Regulator, everyone now knows, will be part of the Health and Safety Executive. They are in the process right now of recruiting the new role of Chief Inspector of Buildings, which will be very important. We expect that position to be announced early in the new year. The new regulator will not be fully in force until the regulations are passed, which is likely to be in 2023. But what I will say is that you will see the regulator increasingly operating in shadow mode as we move into 2021. And there are plans in place to introduce one of the first gateways into the new build system as early as June next year.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a question here from Gavin Dunn at CABE. First of all, thank you very much for your continued service in supporting the construction industry and coming to terms with the changes that is needed. But Gavin wanted to raise a question. A parliamentary committee recently stated that a duty holder choice should be removed from all forms of building control. In response to the draft building safety bill, do you agree? And if so, how would this affect plans for the development of a new building safety regulator and the ability to maintain sufficient capacity in the current building control market during that transition period over to the new regulator?
Okay, this is, so you, early on in my presentation, I talked about conflicts of interest. This was one of the worst examples of that, I think, that I came across. It wasn't the only one by any means, but for me, it was a very obvious conflict, and I was surprised that no one had picked it up before or done anything about it. Perhaps I should say, but it clearly can't be right, in my view, for the contractor who is building a new high-rise building to choose their own regulator, which is what's been happening. And I think that has been fundamental in this race to the bottom. What we have to have is the person who is doing the regulating being independent. That doesn't necessarily mean they have to work for the public sector. They can work in the private sector, but they have to know and be clear that they are working for the regulator and are commissioned to do their task by the regulator, not working for the developer.
Thank you. Could I ask a question of the extension? You talked about the broader aspects and the focus on beyond just the high-risk buildings to the broader aspects of managing quality in the construction sector. How do you see third-party accreditation in other key roles? For example, in the management of CDM regulations through supply chains, for example, with the SSIP scheme, how do you see third-party accreditation coming into that as well?
I think there are a lot of opportunities here that are worthy of exploring. One of the conversations that we're having right now as the Industry Safety Steering Group is with the Considerate Constructors scheme. Now, I'm sure there will be people on this call who have their own views of the Considerate Construction scheme as is. What we're talking to them about is a building safety and quality charter that will have some real teeth and which will set a standard that any organisation in this sector has to achieve before it can become accredited by them as being a company you can trust in this area. And I think that is just as important in many ways, provided it can be done and have credibility, as it is to have a tough regulator who will hold those who are failing to comply to account. That's what I meant about having both incentives and sanctions in the system. I think we have to find a way in this new system of creating market differentiation so that we can all choose to go to the people that we know we can trust.
Thank you. I'm afraid we've only got time for one more question. Again, thank you very much, Dame Judith, for your time. It's been a superb presentation. But this final question points to the future. And you said, especially from your background in chemical engineering and reflecting on the work that's been done in many different sectors in terms of the digitization of records and management of records, that connectivity, that transparency across the sectors, which is essential now going forward for new builds. How do you see that coming in place? Digitization for the supply chain. How can we collaborate more and integrate more digitally to enable supply chains, especially for construction materials?
As I said, I think one of the ways to accelerate the pace of it is to learn from other sectors. To any one of us, it would be unthinkable if we bought a car or a washing machine or anything else, if someone said they couldn't trace all of the parts that have gone into making it. And yet the biggest expenditure we all undertake when we buy a house, if you ask the people who built it, what was it made of and where did the bits come from, they can't tell you. I just find that extraordinary. So if this industry wants to make that leap, there's an awful lot of people out there it can learn from.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Dame Judith. Really appreciate it. And with that, I'll pass back to Jamie.
Thank you.
Dame Judith, thank you very much. As I said a moment ago, your words to us this morning have been a tour de force. They've also, I think, been proof that the appointment that the government made when they put you into your role was an inspired choice. Grenfell was the most appalling tragedy, but because of your work, I think there is every prospect of a very positive legacy coming out of that horrible tragedy. As anticipated, Judith, thank you very much for sharing the lessons from both Grenfell, from COVID, and from other sectors. They have the obvious application, obviously, to construction, but as I said before, they have an application to other sectors as well. And I think for many on this call who are not specifically in the construction area, they will have heard those lessons loud and clear that you set out, dealing with safety and quality assurance, competence, systems thinking, systems cultures, joined up regulation, outcomes-based frameworks, and so forth. So you've given us a fantastic tour of a very important work stream that you've been overseeing. It's got an obvious relevance to all of us, I think, in our different sort of walks of life, not just the construction industry. Judith, thank you very much for celebrating UKAS's 25th anniversary with this amazing and wonderful lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much.